Good evening, everybody. First of all, thanks to Maury for inviting me to deliver this year's Excelsior address. In 2002, the Canadian author and philosopher John Ralston Saul wrote, and I quote, "Any weakening of universal public education can only be a weakening of the long-standing essential role universal public education plays in making us a civilised democracy." End quote. Tonight I'd like to expand the prism through which public education is so often perceived by considering the ways in which public educators and public education can respond to the challenges inherent in operating within a challenged democratic society. While much ink and paper is spent on debating the economic costs and benefits of education, far too little recognition is given to the enormous contribution that education in general, and public education in particular, makes to the personal, intellectual and social capital of our Australian nation and the wider international community. What, for example, are the role that education in general and public education in particular should play in confronting issues of national, indeed global significance? For example, what forces can expose, then tackle, the global obscenity recently revealed by the United Nations that in 2005 100 million children were sold into slavery, the vast majority of these poor children being sold into sexual slavery. In all its complex and often contradictory aspects, what has been called the war on terrorism dominates much of our contemporary social, political and humanitarian discourse as we survey our immediate past, reflect over the present and contemplate our future. Where will we find the foundation of wisdom to identify and expose contemporary intellectual, religious or spiritual ignorance wherever manifestations of such ignorance flourish? How can humanity respond to the challenge of progressing towards that loving human fellowship preached by the charismatic and holy founders of the world's great religions, whose inspiration and sanctity have so consistently been besmirched down the ages by too many of their acolytes who have been bigots or selectively fundamentalist? What forces will protect us from the evils imposed on and within society under the banner of terrorism on the one hand, or under the banner of protecting us from terrorism on the other? What forces do we need to ensure that our civil liberties are not trampled upon, that people are not denied their basic human rights, that those legal rights enshrined in the Magna Carta and other seminal legal testaments, which are at the core of our Australian democratic values, are not besmirched? That our political and other leaders do not trample upon the presumption of innocence until proven guilty, the protection of habeas corpus, freedom of the press, trial by jury as distinct from trial by media, freedom of association, equal rights under the law without fear or favour, and so on. That as an educated democratic community, we strive to arrive at a proper balance between a necessary insistence on protecting us from terrorists on the one hand, and on the other hand, a necessary insistence on not stripping ourselves of those very democratic ideals that the terrorists seek to destroy. That innocent people on London trains are not only protected from the evil of terrorist bombs, but also are protected from cold-blooded killing by police who then seek to cover up the truth with a farrago of lies. Of course, these kinds of questions have been addressed by our predecessors within different historical contexts. For example, in the latter half of the 19th century, that very fine poet, public servant, literary critic and public educator Matthew Arnold came to the conclusion that because of the decline in the power of the established Church of England, the moral fibre of British civilisation would now have to be found, I quote, in contact with the best which has been thought and said in the world, unquote. In particular, Arnold looked to the power of literature and its attenuated cultural values to provide bulwarks against those forces that threatened society. World War I would smash so much of this idealism, hope and confidence generated within the Victorian and Edwardian eras. Last year my wife Jackie, our young daughters Sophie and Millie and I were deeply moved as we followed the footsteps of those hundreds of thousands of soldiers obliterated on the killing fields of the Battle of the Somme and the 3 battles for Ypres in Belgium. In particular, we made a pilgrimage to the most famous of the Australian battlefield sites, notably Fromelles, Villers-Bretonneux, Poitiers, Thiepval a milky farm. Indeed, I found myself in tears as I wheelchaired my way around the Tyncott Cemetery at Passchendaele. In addition to the thousands of graves of British, Australian, South African, Canadian soldiers, around the huge wall of the monument were listed the names of 33,000 of their comrades whose bodies were never found. And then later I was overwhelmed at the list of 55,000 names of British and Dominion soldiers who died around Ypres, but whose bodies were never found and whose names are recorded on the Menin Gate. These are in addition to the approximately 145,000 who are buried in cemeteries elsewhere. Even today, it remains almost incomprehensible that such a high proportion of the then Australian male population, aged between 16 and 35, and even older, had their lives destroyed on the other side of the earth. Yet what have we learnt? Forgotten, remembered. To what can we look today in attempting to avoid the follies of the past and of the present as we confront our future? Surely, again, it must be education, above all public education, in all its depth, breadth and rigour, in all of its intellectual, moral, spiritual, physical and cultural dimensions, and public education accessible to all, anywhere and everywhere in the world, an education which, among its other values, is committed to helping students in the universal human need to search for truth and meaning. A quality public education that is informed, is honest, critiqued and properly resourced, that is both properly idealistic and properly sceptical, that celebrates the virtues of compassion, justice, human rights, honesty and integrity, and which repudiates tyranny, ignorance, fundamentalism of all kinds and terrorism, whatever and wherever be its sources around the globe. Now that's a huge task. But without a truly educated global world, we will all be condemned to suffering the inevitable consequences of failing to learn from history and running the risk of wiping out the world as we know it. For example, without public education in the fullest sense of the word, we in the West will continue to cast a blind eye upon the evils before our own very own eyes. Such as was the initial response to the genocide in Rwanda, where the United Nations failed so miserably, or in the breakup of Yugoslavia, where for too long the Christian West turned its back on the slaughter of the Muslims until it was too late, or the savage attack on Israeli citizens by Hezbollah, and the grossly disproportionate response by Israel, and the resulting atrocities committed against the Lebanese people last year, and the truly appalling contemporary genocide being inflicted on the untold scores of thousands of people in Sudan, particularly in Darfur. Just a few months ago on TV, I saw a distraught Sudanese mother holding her starving child, who was asked by a reporter, "What do you need most for your child?" "Food and education," was the poor woman's immediate reply. As public educators, we have a responsibility to try to ensure that our students learn from history and from what we know of the present, and that they and their generation do not end up replicating our historical failures, but build upon our historical successes. There's one policy to which every single government in Australia, without exception, has signed up to. It's called the Adelaide Declaration on National Goals for Schooling in the 21st Century, generally referred to as the Adelaide Declaration. Now, it's got three basic goals. We are to encourage the development of our kids, our students, as human beings. We are to encourage and develop their knowledge within a whole range of curriculum content and across a demanding range of literacy, numeracy, information technology and other skills, including those with general application to later employment, education and training. But there is a third foundational goal. It might come as a surprise to some of our radio jocks and certain ranting newspaper columnists who give the impression that schooling is merely about inculcating functional literacy and numeracy, that under the Adelaide Declaration, all teachers are required to develop within their students, and I quote, "the capacity to exercise judgment and responsibility in matters of morality, ethics and social justice, and the capacity to make sense of their world, to think about how things got to be the way they are, to make rational and informed decisions about their own lives, and to accept responsibility for their own actions," end quote. as well as to, and I quote again, be active and informed citizens with an understanding and appreciation of Australia's system of government and civic life, end quote. Therefore, we have responsibility as public educators not only to support the intellectual and personal growth of our students, but also to help them develop as ethically and morally responsible citizens, aware of injustice, misery, and indeed of evil, and of justice, happiness, and indeed of goodness. To do this, we public educators must be men and women of awareness, sensitively and finely attuned to the world in which we live, and committed to its sustainable improvement. This cannot be done effectively without taking account of the purposes and goals of our democratic, multicultural, multi-faithed and non-faithed kaleidoscopic Australian society within which we live in an ever-changing world. This constitutes a tremendous challenge to us, both as public educators and as citizens living within a challenged democratic society. Let me draw to a finish. Afflicted with motor neurone disease and given only 3 to 5 years to live when I was diagnosed with this incurable terminal disease 11 years ago, I have to talk about the future with some caution. MND has now almost completely paralysed my body, but my brain and my voice seem to be holding up okay. To try to sum up my own public education values and aspirations, I always like to quote these days from the end of chapter 10 of my autobiography, A Passion for Life, which ABC Books published in 2004. In writing that chapter, I reflected over the quality of public education that I demand for our 2 children, Amelia, who is now in Year 7, and Sophia, who has commenced her Year 12 studies, both at Cherrybrook Technology High School. Of course, they have always attended public schools because my wife Jackie and I are deeply committed to public education. So I'll finish my little speech by quoting what I wrote then and continue to believe passionately now. And I'm quoting from that chapter in my book. Therefore, not just as a professional educator, but as a dad, I want all future teachers of my Sophie and Millie to abide by 3 fundamental principles that I believe should underpin teaching and learning in every public school. First, to nurture and challenge my daughter's intellectual and imaginative capacities way out to horizons unsullied by self-fulfillingly minimalist expectations. So don't patronise them with lowest common denominator blancmange masquerading as knowledge and learning, nor crush their love for learning through boring pedagogy. Don't bludgeon them with mindless busy work and limit the exploration of the world of evolving knowledge merely to the tyranny of repetitively churned out, recycled worksheets. Ensure that there is legitimate progression of learning from one day, 1 week, month, term and year to the next. Second, please care for Sophie and Millie with humanity and sensitivity as developing human beings, worthy of being taught with genuine respect, enlightened discipline and imaginative flair. And third, please strive to maximise their potential for later schooling, post-school education, training and employment, and for the quality of life itself, so that they can contribute to and enjoy the fruits of living within an Australian society that is fair, just, tolerant, honourable, knowledgeable, prosperous and happy. When all is said and done, surely this is what every parent and every student should be able to expect of school education, not only as delivered within every public school in New South Wales, but within every school, not only in Australia, but throughout the entire world. Thank you.